Okay, so 1950s Cold War. First thing you think of usually, of course, is the Korean War. Now, how did all this start? After declaring war on Japan at the end of World War II, the Soviets sent troops to Japan-occupied Korea. And yes, they declared war at the end of World War II. Thanks a lot, Soviets. We established a presence in the southern part of the peninsula, and the Soviets began cutting roads and communications at the 38th parallel, and two separate Koreas began to emerge. The Soviets worked with communist North Korea to set up their government and establish the People's Republic, led by Kim Il sung, who was the supreme leader until 1994 when Kim Jong il and then Kim Jong un and all their fabulous haircuts. The UN recommended elections. The South held elections. The North, shockingly, did not. The South would elect Syngman Rhee as president. When the U.S. removed itself from South Korea, North Korea invaded almost immediately. Again, nothing surprising here. The key issues from the American point of view. Now, why was this a problem? Communists had won the Civil War in China. Mao had defeated Chiang. Truman and the administration were seen as quote unquote losing China. Thus, they needed credibility. The word I emphasize most when we talk about the Cold War, credibility. Truman pledged defense of Korea, sought a coalition through the United Nations. One problem, of course, was the Soviet Union was on the Security Council, thus they could veto. We talked about this last week. But the Soviet Union could not veto in this case because it was boycotting the Security Council for not allowing communist China into the UN. So we went to Korea, led by Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur led a force comprised of mostly American and South Korean troops. He pushed the North Koreans back behind the 38th parallel and sought to further invade. And Truman okayed this with the understanding the Chinese would not participate. If the Chinese participated, all bets are off. Come back. The Allied force would push North Korea to the Yalu River, which was the border between North Korea and Manchuria. The Chinese, of course, could not accept this. No nation could. And Premier Zhou Enlai declared the Chinese would enter the fray to prevent Americans from entering China. America ignored this, and 400,000 Chinese troops attacked American forces in North Korea, eventually pushing them back to the 38th parallel. By Christmas, sorry, MacArthur was not pleased. He called for more action against North Korea and the Chinese. He was not shy of sharing his thoughts either, and often spoke out about the need to win, eradicate communism in Korea, and even push into China to oust its communism. He wanted to use nationalist Chinese troops on mainland China to try and turn back the communist tide. He was warned by Truman to clear all public statements with him, but MacArthur was MacArthur, and he would continue on his way, publicly declaring the need for aggression. Again, without Truman's okay. Truman concluded, quote, "The son of a bitch isn't going to resign on me. I want him fired." And on April 3rd, 1951, that is what happened. Truman fired MacArthur. The president fired one of the most popular and famous generals in American history. He would be roundly criticized for it. MacArthur, for his part, returned to a hero's welcome in San Francisco and a huge parade in downtown Manhattan. He even addressed a joint session of Congress to discuss how he was prevented from doing what he really wanted, that he could have won if Truman would have just given him the thumbs up. It is in this speech in which his famous "old soldiers never die, they just fade away" was spoken. The remainder of the war would remain a stalemate, with the front line continuing at the 38th parallel. Eisenhower would take over after Truman, we'll get more on him later, and would continue to press the North Koreans, even threatening the use of the bomb as Truman had. Peace talks continued indefinitely from 1951 until 1953, the main issue being North Korean prisoners of war. The North wanted them repatriated, while the South declared that these prisoners of war simply wanted to stay in the South. And eventually they would be freed in South Korea to do what they wanted. In June of 1953, the agreement was signed, calling for a division of Korea temporarily until the two could hold talks for unification. Again, it's important to mention this was a temporary agreement. The U.S. forces would remain under UN auspices until an agreement could be worked out, and a demilitarized zone 5 kilometers wide separated the two until reunification. We're still waiting for reunification. Almost 70 years later. Now, China was key to the Korean War. We had sent only a fraction of our military over to battle North Korea, China, and the Soviet coalition. But still, again, I mean, this was somewhat limited for obvious reasons. Now, a few impacts, of course, this would abet McCarthy's rise as the Cold War heated up. We talked about McCarthy in the other video lecture for this week on anti-communism. Again, Truman fires MacArthur, and this only kind of perpetuates the confusion around the Cold War, what should be done, what can be done. Now, and of course, one can look at today, did our lack of victory only enable North Korea to continue on its ways? Well, the Cold War at this time would remain cold. Relations remain tenuous at best. We talked about the Truman Doctrine. Now we'll get to the Eisenhower Doctrine. What was the Eisenhower Doctrine? It essentially extended the Truman Doctrine to the Middle East. Eisenhower pledged American support to any governments fighting communist insurgencies in the Middle East. We would send over 5,000 Marines to Lebanon to forestall an anti-Western takeover there. Eisenhower would also practice brinksmanship. Well, he and Dulles. China sought to take over the Taiwanese islands of Quemoy and Matsu. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles practiced brinksmanship. He told China that any aggressive actions toward the islands would be met with force from the U.S., so he pushed them to the brink. This was essentially a game of chicken. China would shell the islands, but eventually did not go in at the time. We also see threats of mass retaliation, which are, of course, key to nuclear warfare. Mutually assured destruction. If you bomb us, we'll bomb you, and we're all going to be dead. That is the greatest deterrent to war. Strength in numbers. Anyway, mass retaliation. Eisenhower announced, again, this policy of mass retaliation, that any attack by Soviets on the U.S. or its allies would be met with nuclear force. And of course, MAD would remain kind of the main deterrent up until the end of the Cold War. Now, in 1957, the Soviets would get a step up on us, putting Sputnik into orbit. Panic strikes America. Many go to Sears to purchase bomb shelter kits. There's an excellent Happy Days episode that deals with the bomb shelter and how people just obsessed over them. But when we get to the 70s, we'll talk a little bit more about that. So again, many Americans panic. They get their bomb shelter kits. We also see the creation of NASA, National Aeronautical and Space Administration, to get us into the space race. This would also intensify focus on math and science in the schools. Now, in 1960, this is out of the purview of the 50s, but it's a continuation of what we see here. The Soviets would actually shoot down a U-2 spy plane. Now, this was part of a larger espionage effort against the Soviets and against China. Thousands of our pilots flew these types of missions. They took pictures of harbors, factories, shipyards, military bases, etc. in the 50s and 60s. This secret air war actually led to 252 American men being shot down between 1950 and 1970. 24 lost their lives, 90 survived, 138 remain unaccounted for. In Iran, we see a major action which we partake in for Cold War reasons, and this will have long-standing impact on our relations with Iran. Anybody who remembers 1979 knows what I'm talking about. Now, an Iran nationalist premier, Mohammad Mossadegh, was upset with the British after World War II. The British and their Anglo-Iranian oil company gave Iran only 20% of its oil revenues. Now, after World War II, we see massive decolonization. Most empires get rid of their colonies. They're difficult to control. They're difficult to maintain. There are obviously many more freedom movements. And for the most part, these empires get rid of these colonies, but there are some that hold on. Of course, France would hold on to French Indochina or Vietnam, and Britain would hold on to Iran, or at least maintain their influence as long as possible. And you can understand the Iranian dissatisfaction receiving only 20% of the oil revenues from its own country. Mossadegh sought to nationalize the company in 1951, seizing it and expelling the British. Truman initially sought peace, but the two sides could not come to an agreement. By 1953, Mossadegh started campaigning for the eviction of the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The British had wanted to strike sooner. They did not believe Truman or Eisenhower later would be totally amenable to such action. Eisenhower, for his part, though, began to worry that Iran was going down a road to communism. So, along with the British, we initiated a coup. We paid street mobs to harass Mossadegh. We promoted the work of pro-Shah crowds throughout the country. Pro-Shah army units took to the streets. Mossadegh would actually and night riots would happen, and Mossadegh would escape a night riot barely and get out of the country. There would be no civil war, but we would establish a pro-Western regime. Now, this, of course, has long-term ramifications. You get to the 1979 Iranian Revolution, the taking of 52 hostages, the embarrassment that occurred during that time. And when we get to Jimmy Carter and his inability to handle that problem, it's really one of the more embarrassing episodes in American history. And this, really, this is what starts it. This is another example where we probably were in a place where we shouldn't have been. And Iran and other Middle Eastern countries would harbor antipathy toward us for decades due to our involvement in the United States. I worked under Professor Chinchilla, Cinciala, when I was at KU. She is an expert on Middle Eastern affairs. And she informed us that it wasn't because of our support of Israel that Arab countries in the Middle East disliked us. Rather, it was our involvement over there at all. The fact that we're in their countries, often uninvited, trying to control matters, that's what led to the antipathy. So, something to consider. Again, I would look up Chinchilla. She was an excellent historian. So that is Iran. We can go to South America, Guatemala. In 1950, Colonel Jacobo Arbenz won power in the country's freest elections in history. The problem, he was an SD. What is an SD? That is a social democrat. A social democrat is a socialist who uses democracy to instill socialist policies. So you follow the guidelines set up by the vote, democracy, you're elected, then you can put in your socialist policies. Again, it's pretty standard. We see that a lot in Western Europe after World War II. Now, one thing about Arbenz, though, he would actually base many of his ideas quite consciously on Roosevelt's New Deal. He sought to wean Guatemalan dependence on the Boston-based United Fruit Company, which owned nearly half of Guatemala. The United Fruit Company was known as El Pulpo there, the octopus that strangles all that it touches. This is another example. This is kind of unofficial imperialism, but this is, again, us not letting go of colony. Again, an unofficial colony. Arbenz expropriated 400,000 acres of United Fruit land. He gave it to 100,000 landless Mayans. He offered $1.2 million for this land, which was the valuation on the tax return, but United Fruit claimed the land was now valued at $15.9 million. The CIA tried to portray Arbenz as a tool of the Kremlin. Parachuted in Russian-made arms into Guatemala, organized what was considered a spontaneous revolution by paying some of the country's military to allow a force of 150 paid liberators to march in from Honduras under Carlos Castilla Armas. Armas did not get far. The United States contract pilots lightly bombed Guatemala City until Arbenz fled. Armas was a brutal totalitarian. 9,000 liberal leftist suspects were rounded up and many were shot. Peasants lost their land and their right to vote. Over the next 35 years, 150 to 200,000 Guatemalans died due to Armas and his brutality. Most of these were peasants terrorized by army and death squads. One of the impacts of this is we became recognized as supporters of an autocratic regime in South America and autocratic regimes in general, which ultimately may have aided Fidel Castro in his Cuban Revolution. I would also look back to what Kennan had mentioned, don't become that which you are trying to defeat. If you do, then you're just as bad as them, and that may be what we see here. We also have another operation here, and I just heads up, an offensive term, this is what it was called, Operation Wetback. From 1944 through 1954, 44 through 54, a number of illegal aliens coming from Mexico to the United States rose by 6,000%. This Eisenhower program, Operation Wetback, attempted to send them back, claiming their presence was detrimental to both the economy and society. So again, this further antagonizes many south of the United States, and you can understand, some of the disdain. We're going to finish up with the kitchen debate, 1959. Now, this was a U.S. exhibition in Moscow. It was part of a larger cultural exchange between the two countries. The Soviets had theirs in the United States. We had ours in Moscow. Each country had its own exposition. Now, at this, Nixon and Khrushchev began to argue with each other. They lobbed insults at each other. They argued about the benefits of each economic system. There's finger pointing, and each would actually point his finger in the other's chest while arguing. Nixon showed Khrushchev the color TV, the many conveniences the American home offered. The two stood at a kitchen of a model house, which Nixon said any steelworker or veteran could buy for just $14,000 over 25 to 30 years. Khrushchev kind of fumbled. He exaggerated that the newly built Russian houses would also have this equipment in a few years. Both ended up easing up on each other, but this was a public battle that riled up the media and very much reflected kind of the early animosities of the Cold War. And you have two major Cold Warriors going at it, Richard Nixon and Nikita Khrushchev. Now, each, of course, will find their own fame or infamy going forward. Khrushchev was a pretty brave soul, willing to call out Stalin, of course, after Stalin was dead. He wasn't that stupid. But Khrushchev deserves some credit. But again, we'll get to Cuba here in a couple weeks, too. For his part, Khrushchev would come to the United States. He traversed the continent. He met with Eisenhower. He actually met with many average Americans. He seemed willing to work with the United States. Eisenhower trusted him. He was a bit crazy. He was kind of cartoonish, but he was a strong leader nonetheless. And again, he had ingratiated himself with many American citizens by talking to them directly. Again, interesting. What if Stalin had done that? What if Lenin had done that? Of course, it's crazy to think about that. But again, it kind of shows, the Cold War is at its peak, but still there is some humanity.